Ford and John Deere just shut down U.S. production. And Trump's response? It wasn't a statement. It was a warning shot across the entire heartland. In one brutal move, America's manufacturing giants walked away from their own backyard. Jobs gone, factories silent, and the president who once promised to bring it all back. He lashed out with tariffs so aggressive they risked collapsing the very towns he vowed to protect. This wasn't economic strategy. This was personal. Why did two of America's most iconic companies abandon their roots? Why did Trump's retaliation backfire so catastrophically? And what does this mean for your job, your savings, and your future? What's happening? What most people didn't know, what Trump himself may not have known, was that John Deere had left the building long before his tariffs hit, not in a dramatic, press-covered walkout, but silently, strategically, permanently. Months earlier, Deere had committed to a sweeping global reorganization. New plants were already breaking ground in Brazil. Advanced automation lines were being calibrated in Germany. A massive expansion in India had received quiet tax incentives and logistical guarantees. The company's research and development budget was being funneled into Asia, not Illinois. Internally, Deere executives had stopped asking how to keep production in America and started asking how to survive without it. Leaked memos from within the company painted a clear picture. Deere was preparing for instability, not just in the market but in Washington. The tone of the correspondence was surgical. This wasn't defiance. It wasn't rebellion. It was adaptation. One VP described it as removing emotional exposure from politically volatile regions. In plain English, if American politics were going to be a liability, Deere would stop betting on America. And that's exactly what happened. When Trump made his tariff announcement, Deere's boardroom didn't panic. They nodded. They had already filed patents abroad, signed shipping contracts out of Mumbai, and secured European regulatory certifications. His threat was validation, not deterrent. The machine had moved on. To Trump's supporters, it looked like betrayal. But to Deere's executives, it was logic. You can't build billion-dollar equipment inside a burning house. You build where the climate is stable, the labor predictable, and the rules don't change every 4 years. Deere didn't defy America. They outgrew it. But Trump's biggest backer in Detroit. That story cut deeper. Ford's exit strategy. Unlike John Deere, Ford didn't need to make a statement. It didn't need to explain. It didn't even need to warn. Because while Trump railed against foreign dependency, Ford had already begun building its escape tunnel, and it was nearly finished. In quiet legal filings and hushed quarterly calls, Ford had slowly shifted major electric vehicle production to Mexico and Vietnam. Contracts were signed. Equipment was moved. And American factories saw their expansion plans stall. First gradually, then entirely. A new electric SUV plant that was once promised for Tennessee, canceled. Investment in autonomous vehicle testing in Ohio, postponed. A major tooling project in Kentucky, liquidated. But Ford did something else too. It refused to make noise. While Trump played the populist drum in front of cameras, Ford played chess in silence. The company never criticized the tariffs, never picked a side. Instead, it maneuvered beneath the political radar, reducing exposure and optimizing margins without triggering public backlash. And why wouldn't they? Labor costs in Vietnam were a fraction of what they were in Detroit. Environmental compliance was looser. Raw materials were closer. Tariffs or no tariffs. The numbers made the decision easy, and Ford executives knew something Trump either ignored or forgot. A multinational automaker answers to math, not to politicians. To the outside world, Ford still looked American. Trucks rolled off assembly lines with flags on their bumpers. Dealerships still stocked patriotic brochures. But beneath the surface, the company had already pivoted. Trump's demand for loyalty was met with spreadsheets. Loyalty didn't pay dividends. Efficiency did. But Trump wasn't about to be humiliated without a fight. The loyalty test, and Trump failed it. For Donald Trump, this wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years building a brand around being the savior of American manufacturing. He wore hard hats on stage. He promised the rebirth of Motor City. He toured Iowa fields and called John Deere the pride of American ingenuity. These companies weren't just corporations to him. They were campaign co-stars. He believed they owed him something. So when they left, silently, surgically, and without remorse, Trump took it personally. He tried to reframe it as treason. "They stabbed us in the back," he said in a Truth Social post. But behind the bluster was something raw, a man realizing his influence was paper-thin in the face of corporate calculus. The loyalty test failed because it was based on a fantasy. Trump believed he could govern Fortune 500 firms the same way he rallied voters, with threats, emotion, and slogans. But corporations don't cheer. They don't wear red hats. They follow markets, not personalities. And when the pressure came, Ford and Deere didn't flinch. They didn't come crawling, they vanished. Because the truth is, the social contract Trump assumed, I defend you, you stay loyal, never existed. It was theater. Ford and Deere didn't need his protection. They needed predictability. And in his second presidency, Trump offered the opposite. What broke wasn't just a policy. It was a world view. In the diners of Ohio and the workshops of Iowa, that break was felt in silence. No one shouted, no one wept. But the illusion of made in America, of industrial rebirth, of corporate patriotism, cracked. And in Iowa, the illusion finally shattered. If this feels bigger than business, you're right. We spent weeks on the data, the memos, the fallout. If you're getting something real from this, hit subscribe. It tells us to keep digging. The Iowa Meltdown. It was supposed to be a rally, a celebration of strength, loyalty, and the revival of American industry. But when Donald Trump took the stage in Iowa, he didn't energize the crowd. He shocked them. Farmers, factory workers, and Ford loyalists had packed into the bleachers with their kids, their flags, and their hopes. What they got instead was a political detonation, a 200% tariff on John Deere products manufactured overseas, and a 25% penalty slapped on imported Ford vehicles. The reaction wasn't outrage, it was confusion. People didn't cheer, they did math. In real time, you could see it on their faces. How much more would a new combine cost next season? Could they afford to replace that aging F-Series truck now? A few supporters tried to applaud, but most just stared, mouths tight, minds racing. Iowa isn't just another state on the map. It's John Deere country, Ford country. These aren't just brands. They are lifelines, stitched into the DNA of the land. When Trump turned on them, he wasn't punishing some distant CEO in Manhattan. He was targeting the very machines that plow the fields, harvest the corn, haul the livestock, and deliver the kids to school. And then came the slow exodus. Not a riot, not a protest. Just rows of supporters trickling silently out of the stadium, as if waking from a long and dangerous dream. At truck stops across the state, the conversation had changed. At breakfast counters and grain elevators, people were murmuring. Some were furious, some were heartbroken. All were doing the math, because the illusion that Trump and the working class were perfectly aligned had cracked. And that crack, it wasn't going away. But back in boardrooms, the corporations were already 2 steps ahead. The corporate chess game. While Trump was lighting political fires across the Midwest, inside the sleek glass towers of Deere and Ford, no one was surprised. There were no emergency meetings, no panic, because they'd seen this coming. Contingency planning wasn't a reaction. It was a foundation. By the time the president made his threats, both companies were already executing plans that had been in motion for months. At Ford's headquarters, legal teams had mapped out every trade scenario. They weren't worried about tweets. They had war rooms filled with analysts, lawyers, and lobbyists who were already working Congress through back channels. Ford's public relations division had pre-written talking points for conservative media, messaging that framed their overseas expansion not as abandonment, but as strategic preservation. And it was working. Local papers in the Rust Belt ran op-eds about global competitiveness. Talk radio shows downplayed the tariffs as temporary turbulence. Over at John Deere, the game plan was even more aggressive. The company had diversified supply lines long before Trump's announcement, new routes through Brazil, secondary suppliers in India, automated facilities in Europe that could ramp up if needed. Deere executives didn't fear retaliation. They expected it, and they had the leverage to outlast it. What Trump never understood is that you cannot strong-arm a multinational corporation with nationalistic slogans. These companies don't answer to borders, they answer to balance sheets. And in a volatile economy, stability beats patriotism every time. CEOs weren't fighting Trump on stage. They were beating him behind closed doors with silence, precision, and spreadsheets. In small towns, however, the silence was growing louder with each passing day. The dealership rebellion. In towns like Ottawa, Iowa, and Van Buren, Arkansas, the impact didn't begin with protests. It began with a whisper, then a pause, then silence. Dealerships that once echoed with engine noise and small talk were suddenly quiet. Service bays sat empty. Salesmen stared at their phones, waiting for walk-ins that never came. Within days of the tariff announcement, foot traffic dropped by nearly 30%. Farmers who had come in to place orders were now canceling. Mechanics, once booked out for weeks, found themselves with open schedules. One dealership manager said it felt like someone hit a light switch and turned off the business. Another said he'd never seen this kind of fear, not even during the Great Recession. Layoffs began quietly. Hours got cut, sales teams shrank, and in the places where Trump flags once hung in showroom windows, managers were taking them down. Not out of anger, but out of survival. Talking politics at the counter was now considered bad for business. Customers weren't just mad, they were nervous. And nervous customers don't buy. This wasn't just about money, it was about identity. These dealerships were more than storefronts. They were community pillars. They sponsored Little League teams. They hosted charity drives. They were run by people who believed in American industry, in Trump's promises, in the idea that the Midwest was finally making a comeback. And now they felt abandoned, used, left to take the hit while the corporations sailed on and the politicians made speeches. And Wall Street, it was about to set the next fire. The tariffs that backfired, in disguise. The numbers didn't lie. Within weeks, new John Deere combines had jumped by more than 25%. F-Series pickups climbed well past affordability for the average middle-class buyer. And parts, filters, belts, transmission components suddenly cost more and took longer to arrive. But the damage wasn't just on the invoice. It was online. TikTok videos went viral, showing side-by-side price comparisons from 6 months earlier. Facebook groups for farmers and truckers lit up with spreadsheets, complaints, and calls for boycott. Hashtags spread. Memes mocked the administration. People weren't just angry. They were documenting their decline in real time. And through it all, trust eroded. Not just in Trump, not just in Ford or Deere, but in the entire American story. The one where you work hard, buy American, invest in your community, and the system rewards you back. That story was unraveling. And fast. Parents who once told their kids that building tractors or trucks was a noble career were now whispering about how to pivot. Diesel mechanics looked for warehouse jobs. Dealership managers polished resumes for jobs in finance or real estate. Entire communities were recalibrating what they thought the future looked like. And it wasn't green and yellow, or red, white, and blue. It was somewhere else. Something else. The tariffs were framed as a defense of American manufacturing. But in practice, they were a self-inflicted wound, one that drove prices higher, confidence lower, and loyalty into the ground. And for retirees in the heartland, the worst was yet to come. Ford's collapse, and so did retirement. It started with a red line on a screen. By the time Donald Trump stepped off the podium in Iowa, Ford's stock was already spiraling. Within 48 hours, the company had lost more than 27% of its market value. Tens of billions of dollars erased in the time it takes to binge-watch a mini-series. For Wall Street, it was a brutal headline. But for rural America, it was a death knell. Because Ford is not just a car maker, it is a cornerstone of retirement for millions of working-class Americans. In small towns across Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, public pension funds had invested heavily in Ford stock, trusting it as a blue-chip symbol of American resilience. Firefighters, police officers, teachers, and sanitation workers had their futures pinned to those dividends. They didn't need CNBC to tell them things were bad. They could see it in their quarterly statements. They could feel it in the anxious phone calls flooding into local credit unions. Entire municipalities were suddenly under financial strain. County pension boards met in emergency sessions. Volunteer fire departments that had once depended on Ford investment returns to fund upgrades and fuel were now slashing overtime and canceling equipment orders. School districts postponed maintenance projects, froze hiring, and began quietly preparing for budget shortfalls. And these weren't theoretical numbers. They were personal. Retirees who had never set foot on Wall Street were watching their nest eggs bleed out in real time. A man in Toledo, who once worked the line at Ford's now-shuttered stamping plant, opened his online banking app to see his retirement savings dip below the break-even point. In Indiana, A retired teacher found that the modest dividend she relied on to supplement her Social Security had been slashed without warning. Across the Rust Belt, the sentiment was the same. They had been told to trust American companies, to invest in what they knew. Now those companies were vanishing and taking their future with them. And this still wasn't the bottom, because as Ford went down, Deere was right behind, and its collapse would send even bigger shockwaves. Deere's Wall Street exodus. What happened next was not a crash. It was a calculated retreat. When Trump confirmed his 200% tariff on agricultural equipment manufactured outside the United States, institutional investors did not wait for further clarification. They began unloading John Deere stock with mechanical precision. In just 5 trading days, more than $36 billion in market capitalization evaporated. This wasn't panic, it was strategy. Mutual funds rebalanced their portfolios. Index funds reduced exposure. Even so-called patriotic investment firms, those that usually clung to American legacy brands as a matter of principle, began trimming their positions. They had seen enough. Deere was bleeding capital, and no amount of Midwestern loyalty could stop the hemorrhaging. What the market saw wasn't just a struggling company, it was a symbol. A company once viewed as unshakable had become politically radioactive. The illusion of immunity was shattered. John Deere's identity as the pride of heartland agriculture no longer carried weight against the harsh arithmetic of investor risk models. The narrative had flipped. This wasn't about backing an American brand. It was about surviving a political storm. Inside Deere headquarters, damage control efforts went into overdrive. Emergency earnings calls were scheduled. Investor memos were rewritten twice in the same day. Behind the scenes, executives made urgent calls to lawmakers they had once wined and dined. But it was too late. Wall Street had spoken, and its verdict was brutal. This wasn't just a rejection of Deere. It was a referendum on the Trump economy itself. The message was clear. Even the most iconic companies were no longer protected from the volatility of presidential impulse. If Trump could go after Deere, he could go after anyone, and the boardrooms knew it. Across the country, a new type of meeting was taking place. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it would change everything. The CEO rebellion begins. They didn't call it a mutiny, at least not out loud. But in Manhattan, in Palo Alto, and behind the tinted windows of private jets, the CEOs of America's most powerful corporations were beginning to do something that hadn't been done in decades. Fight back. It began quietly. Dinners with no press, closed-door summits hosted at private golf clubs and retreats. The guest lists included not just automotive and agricultural executives, but leaders in logistics, tech, and finance. Their common problem? Uncertainty. Trump's economic aggression had become more than a political strategy. It was a business threat. Tariffs were being imposed without warning. Loyal companies were being punished without process. And the cost was no longer hypothetical. Legal teams were instructed to review constitutional options. Economic advisors prepared internal white papers, framing Trump's trade actions as a breach of market stability. Even campaign donations began shifting, not toward Democrats necessarily, but toward primary challengers, alternative Republicans, or anyone who could promise predictability over chaos. None of it was being announced. There were no press releases, no public statements. This revolt wasn't being fought with headlines. It was being fought with capital. Investment was delayed. Hiring freezes were imposed. Strategic offshoring, previously considered too politically risky, was greenlit. In rural America, the effects weren't visible yet. But in corporate America, the shift was already underway. These CEOs weren't activists. They weren't revolutionaries. They were survivalists. And they had made one simple calculation. Trump was no longer good for business. While boardrooms scrambled to protect their futures, everyday Americans were waking up to a different kind of betrayal. Not one from companies, but from the very government that was supposed to protect them. And by the time they looked up, the shift had already happened. The U.S.-Mexico-China shift already happened. While politicians bickered on cable news and campaign rallies echoed with promises to bring jobs home, the global economy had already moved on. The industrial rebirth America was waiting for had quietly been outsourced. And not temporarily, but permanently. The new axis of manufacturing wasn't in Detroit, Toledo, or Peoria. It was south of the border, across the Pacific, and deep into the heart of Asia. the shift wasn't coming. It had already happened. In Guanajuato, Mexico, Ford was completing the next phase of its electric vehicle production line. Massive steel and glass facilities rose like monuments to a future that no longer included Dearborn. John Deere's new supplier pipeline stretched from Pune, India to Recife, Brazil, bypassing traditional U.S. distribution routes entirely. Meanwhile, Shenzhen's robotics sector was feeding the automation arms of both agriculture and auto giants, replacing Midwestern jobs with lightning-fast assembly bots. These weren't isolated moves. In just 5 years, American manufacturing investment declined by double digits, while Mexico's industrial capital spending surged to record highs. From Baja to Querétaro, entire megazones of factories were springing up. Fully wired, highly automated, and globally integrated. Vietnam, once a minor player, was now a hub for light machinery, electronics, and battery components, swallowing up operations that once belonged to small-town Illinois or Indiana. America wasn't losing a trade war. It was being written out of the script. The most jarring part? Corporate America wasn't asking for permission. It wasn't waiting for Washington to stabilize policy, or for the next election cycle to deliver clarity. It was making decisions based on one unforgiving factor: survival. Labor was cheaper abroad. Tax incentives were more generous. Supply chains were faster. Environmental regulation, more flexible, or in some cases, non-existent. From a boardroom perspective, the logic was brutal but obvious. Production in the United States had become a liability. Trump's 200% tariff on Deere's foreign-built equipment didn't scare executives. It confirmed they had made the right call. Because if this is what doing business in America looked like, economic punishment for strategic planning, then the only logical response was to move faster, further, and quieter. And Ford and Deere, they're not hedging, they're relocating for good. Why Ford and Deere may never return. Some still believe these moves are a reaction, temporary responses to volatility or political tension. But anyone who has ever set foot inside a multinational boardroom knows the truth. Ford and John Deere are not reacting. They are evolving. And the direction of that evolution no longer includes a meaningful manufacturing base in the United States. There were no press conferences to explain it, no ribbon-cutting ceremonies or photo ops. These were not declarations, they were deletions. Ford slashed domestic plant investment with a few sentences buried in a quarterly earnings call. John Deere's relocation of key assembly lines out of Illinois and Iowa was announced only to shareholders, deep within a slide deck about production efficiencies. Why the silence? Because these companies understood how it would sound to American workers. Abandonment. And that's exactly what it was. In India, Deere was capitalizing on a rapidly growing domestic agriculture market, a rising middle class, and a labor force that cost a fraction of its U.S. equivalent. Mexico was more than just a cost-saving hub. It was a bridge to the entire Latin American market, made easier by favorable trade agreements. For both companies, these weren't just smart business decisions. They were survival tactics in a global economy where speed and flexibility mattered more than patriotic symbolism. America, on the other hand, had become a battlefield of uncertainty. Tariffs, legal threats, unpredictable regulation, all wrapped in a haze of cultural warfare and political theater. To multinational executives, it wasn't just exhausting, it was untenable. The reality is this: America cannot compete with the structural advantages offered elsewhere. The corporate spreadsheets do not lie. The return on investment is clearer overseas. And in an era where loyalty isn't rewarded, but punished, corporations are choosing stability over nostalgia. But the collapse wasn't just economic. It was emotional, and through it all, no one protected the middle class. Who really lost this war? This wasn't a war between Trump and corporations. It wasn't even a war between left and right. It was a war against the American people, and they lost. Farmers were told that tariffs would defend them. Now they pay tens of thousands more for the same Deere equipment they've used for decades. Tractors are back-ordered. Replacement parts are scarce. Repairs are delayed by months. Some farms are going under not because of drought or debt, but because the tools they rely on became politically toxic. Factory workers were promised jobs would return. Instead, they watched their hometowns shrink, their wages stagnate, and their opportunities vanish. Ford left quietly, and those workers were left with nothing. No press release, no farewell, just a pink slip and a vague suggestion to reskill. Small-town dealerships that once served as community anchors now sit empty. Mechanics laid off, salesmen reassigned. The local economy that revolved around Ford pickups and Deere combines is now spiraling. The diner loses business. The school sees fewer students. The sheriff's department tightens its budget. One decision in a boardroom can unravel an entire ecosystem. And the middle class? It's being hollowed out in real time. Rising prices, declining wages, crumbling trust. What makes this even more devastating is that none of it had to happen this way. Corporate greed and political vanity combined into a perfect storm of betrayal. The workers trusted Trump. The corporations trusted markets. And in the middle stood the American family, watching it all fall apart. So who won this war? Not Trump, not Deere, not Ford, not Wall Street. What remains is a shattered alliance between government, business, and the very people they claim to serve. Unless something changes fast, the idea of a strong, stable, self-sufficient American middle class may soon be just another thing we used to build here, before we outsourced it to somewhere cheaper. If that hits home, drop a comment. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more videos and I will see you on the next one.